The Nightmare Before Christmas from the musical imagination of composer and performer Danny Elfman.
Creation is 100% Tim.
It's me and my team that made the movie.
In 1993, Disney released The Nightmare Before Christmas, a holiday film so peculiar, so unique, and so unbelievably not Disney, that they ended up shuffling it off to one of their other labels. And anyone that's seen Nightmare as many times as I have has to know that it's clearly the product of Tim Burton's genius, right? I mean, his name is in the title. That's right, I always seem to forget that Tim Burton didn't actually direct this. That was actually all done by stop-motion animator Henry Selick, who clearly deserves all the credit for this. Right?
That's me, award-winning animator Henry Selick.
That's not the right Selick. Real funny, Tom.
Sorry.
So wait a minute. Is this Burton's film? Or is it Selick's? Or is it somebody else's? That's exactly what we're investigating today as we attempt to uncover the real creator of The Nightmare Before Christmas. Yeah, this one's gonna get spicy.
Never before have critics declared a movie so visually brilliant and wildly imaginative as Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. Never before has there been such a technically spectacular work of sheer genius. Never before have you experienced a more dazzling and wonderfully wicked motion picture. Expect the impossible, raves Time magazine, and get ready for history-making movie magic. Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, rated PG.
If there's one thing my last video showed me, it's that you'd better be careful when talking about the creative forces behind Nightmare Before Christmas. Suggest even slightly that this is a Tim Burton film, and people will let you know just how backwards you are. And yeah, they have a point. Tim Burton often gets all the credit, even though director Henry Selick and his team did most of the work. And by the sounds of things, this misconception has led to a bit of spiciness between the two. But I've gotta tell you, this is something that I've been digging through for a while now, and it turns out this question of whose movie is this is a whole lot more complicated and even a bit more silly than I ever expected it to be. So let's bring in our primary suspects, go through a bit of theirs and the film's background, and examine the evidence to see if we can get a clearer picture of everyone's involvement in and around The Nightmare Before Christmas. But before we kick off today's deep dive, I've got to tell you about a more serious investigation that I've been conducting with the help of today's sponsor, Aura. Having your identity stolen is no joke, and if you ever even just done a simple Google search of your name, you might be pretty freaked out with what you find. And what's even worse, data brokers are out there selling this information to scammers and robocallers. Not exactly something I want out there and available to just anyone.
Why, of course I'm the guy from the other vault on YouTube. Who else would I be, baby?
This is where Aura comes in. Not only will they find and show me these brokers that are selling my info, but Aura also does the work to automatically submit opt-out requests so that everything is removed. The first day I used Aura, they found 18 data brokers with my info, which would have taken me forever to go through each individually. But because they automatically took care of it, I now have even more time for these Tom Selleck animations. And Aura even has more features that'll protect me and my family from online threats that I can't see. Features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, and more. You get all of that, all in one convenient place for a very affordable price. And if you use my link, aura.com/theothervault, you'll get a free 2-week trial to try out all of these tools and even more. Big thanks to Aura for sponsoring the video. Now back to the investigation. It's hard to get too deep into the inner workings of The Nightmare Before Christmas without beginning with the one and only Tim Burton, so that's exactly who we're gonna start with. If you've seen my last video, then you already know about how Tim Burton grew up in Burbank, California in the 60s and 70s, and found himself gravitating more towards monster movies, art, and animation, rather than the standard social scene.
When you're a kid, you come into the world, things are abstract, and life isn't all la la la. It's like there's darkness, and even in your own as a person, you have either depressed thoughts or you have sides to you. And monster movies were, to me, like the safest way to explore those impulses and those feelings that most people have, even as as a child.
He eventually wound up working as a Disney animator, but was unhappy with having to draw the same bright-eyed talking animals over and over again. Though after being moved over to work as a concept artist, his gothic surrealist style caught the attention of some Disney higher-ups who were impressed enough to fund a full project for both him and his creative partner Rick Heinrichs. This project was 1982's Vincent, a stop-motion animated poem born out of Tim's own imagination and love of Vincent Price, along with Rick's own technical artistry. The final short ended up being very different from anything else Disney had done before, and the studio had no idea what to do with it, so they buried it. But looking at Vincent now, it's pretty clear just how much groundwork it laid for The Nightmare Before Christmas, at least when it comes to the visuals and general vibe. After Vincent had wrapped, Tim started to flesh out his next project. This too would be based around another poem of his, though it would explore Burton's fascination with the syrupy sweet and crudely animated Rankin Bass Christmas specials that he had grown up with.
Well, I grew up liking those stories like, every Christmas you'd watch things like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer or like The Grinch That Stole Christmas. Those were my favorite like holiday specials when I was growing up. So when I was working at Disney, I designed something that's sort of like the reverse of that. It's like the Grinch in reverse, so to speak, about this character who finds Christmas and loves it and decides to try to do it himself.
And just as Vincent had gone against the grain of what was coming out of Disney at the time, Tim wanted to take things even further. As he describes in his book, Burton on Burton, the first rule of animation is eyes for expression. And so after drawing so many wide-eyed animals while working on The Fox and the Hound, Tim thought it would be funny to have a main character with big black holes where his eyes should be.
Because I love animated characters that have no eyes.
The thing was, while Burton was originally developing Nightmare to be a Christmas special, or a short, or really anything that would actually get made, Disney wasn't so enthusiastic with what they were seeing. And so rather than move forward, both the studio and Tim agreed to shelve Nightmare and move on to something more family-friendly.
If you think I'm tasty and you want my body, come on, Hansel, take a bite.
The Nightmare Before Christmas would remain buried in the vault until well after Tim Burton had been fired by Disney. After he had made major hits like Beetlejuice, Batman, and Edward Scissorhands, and after Disney realized that they already had a history with the hottest director in town. Tim chose Nightmare for his grand return to the House of Mouse, but because he was still working on Batman Returns, and the fact that this animation process was to be so painstakingly slow, he hired stop-motion artist Henry Selick to direct, who we'll get to a bit later, I promise.
So I was chosen for the job because I'm from the same planet, if not the same neighborhood as Tim.
To adapt his 3-page poem into a feature-length screenplay, Burton initially hired Michael McDowell, who he had already worked with on Beetlejuice. This time, though, things didn't quite work out so well for reasons, depending on who you asked. According to Tim Burton, things just didn't work out and the production moved on. But Caroline Thompson, the screenwriter who came in afterwards, has a bit of a different recollection of how things went down. Either way, this was a major problem, because by this point, The Nightmare Before Christmas was already getting ready to start shooting, and they didn't have a script or even a fully fleshed out story. What they did have, though, was frequent Burton composer and our next primary suspect, Danny Elfman, who had been furiously working away on what would become some of the most iconic music of his career. Much like Burton, Elfman had also grown up around the greater Los Angeles area and developed an early interest in classic monster movies.
Why were you and Tim so compatible artistically?
We both grew up on horror films.
Yeah.
And when I met him, he idolized Vincent Price.
Yeah.
And I idolized Peter Lorre.
Yeah.
That kind of defined us for the next 35 years. Vincent Price was often the tormentor of Peter Lorre.
Did you try the knob? No. Quiet. Quiet.
And while Elfman was certainly more of a social animal, he too had his moments of feeling like an outcast, especially when it came to the holidays.
Oh, Christmas was the most depressing time of the year for me. It was a very lonely time for me as a kid. I didn't have other Jewish friends. All my friends were celebrating Christmas, and I was just kind of staying home playing some game in my room or annoying my brother. And I imagined them all together holding hands around a Christmas tree and singing carols and, just the kind of warm family thing in my mind. All my friends are doing this and I'm just like...
But soon, music emerged as his primary interest. And after traveling around Africa for 10 months to explore various musical styles, Danny returned to Southern California, where his brother was just starting a new musical theater group that was unlike anything anybody had ever experienced before.
To open our show, we bring you an act who at first may shock you, but once you get to know them, they'll just boggle your mind. The Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo.
We will now play the rarely performed Haydn Trio for piano, accordion, and triangle. Thank you.
How do you score the Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo?
This is really a tough thing. See, first of all, my son's birthday is next Saturday, and I want to get him something he's never had, and I kept looking at this girl in the front here.
The Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo became just Oingo Boingo after Elfman's brother left the group to make what would become 1980's Forbidden Zone, which also marks Danny's film composing debut. Under Danny Elfman's leadership, Oingo Boingo transitioned into a full-fledged new wave band that gained a sizable following throughout the 80s, peaking with their 1985 album, Dead Man's Party. Not only did it showcase the chart-topping track Weird Science, which was specifically written for the film, but the title track and the band were both featured in Rodney Dangerfield's classic Back to School, which is one of my guilty pleasures.
Say when.
Right after this drink. Hey, what's a band without Bubbles? Hey, Bubbles, come over here, will you?
Little did Danny Elfman realize that it was this spotlight that would lead him towards the next phase in an already amazing career.
I never intended to get into film scoring. Tim Burton and Paul Rubens approached me to do Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
You tried to say no to that.
I did. And I wrote this piece of music for him, and I put it on a cassette and sent it to him, and I thought, I'll never hear from him again. And my manager called me a week later, and he goes, Danny, you got the gig.
I can't wait to hear your cool scores, getting all the big cool reveals and everything. It's real exciting.
You pat my back, and I'll pat yours.
This working relationship between Tim and Danny continued on, and eventually would lead back to Nightmare Before Christmas, which, if you'll remember, needed to get shooting, but still didn't have a script.
The script wasn't coming along, and there was already a studio, and Henry Selick was already up and running. And Tim was just like, we got to get some stuff going. Let's just start in on the songs. And it was beautiful the way we did it, because he would just show up. I was living at that point at Caroline Thompson's house. It was before she was even writing it. There was another writer originally.
Tim would come over every 3 days, and I'd say, just tell me the story like you're telling it to nephews and nieces, around a fire at night. And he would say, okay, come in here, and he'd show me the drawings, and he'd show me what Zero and Jack looked like, and he goes, Jack is wandering into the forest, and he comes across these 3 doors and these 3 trees, and he gets sucked down, and when the door opens, and all this stuff, he has no idea what it is. What is it? What is it? And I'm just going, what's this? What's this? There's color everywhere. And now, it wasn't decided that I was going to sing, but I was slowly becoming more and more attached to the character, because I wasn't quite conscious of it at the moment. But, Jack Skellington is like the king of Halloween land, but he wants something else. And at that moment in time, I had my own band. I had Oingo Boingo, but I wanted out. When you're the songwriter and lead singer in a band, it's like that's your mini universe. That's my Halloween land. I felt this obligation to keep going, because the band depended on me, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. And so I put that into Jack Skellington, my desire to kind of free myself of this responsibility that I felt chained to. So I understood Jack emotionally on that level. Even though the creation is 100% Tim, I was pouring my own feeling into the character.
And while the initial plan was to hire a voice actor to cover both the spoken and singing parts of Jack Skellington, it was pretty clear that Danny was the guy to sing. To fill out the non-singing side of things, veteran actor Chris Sarandon was brought in to do his best Danny Elfman impression.
You know, again, serendipity, but I had a vocal timbre that matched Danny's singing, and that's it.
And what was Tim Burton like?
Tim, I think people who know the movie know he didn't direct it, that Henry Selick directed it. Wonderful stop-motion action animated director. And then I got together with Tim after for ADR.
Which brings us to our final suspect, legendary stop-motion animator Henry Selick. Selick, a native of Glen Ridge, New Jersey, was inspired by many of the same movies as Tim Burton and Danny Elfman, and it was growing up around films like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and The Adventures of Prince Ahmed that sparked his early fascination with the stop-motion animation process. He also attended the California Institute of the Arts, where his various short films got him noticed by Disney recruiters, who hired him as a junior animator for films like Pete's Dragon and The Small One. But much like Burton, Henry quickly found himself unsatisfied with what he was working on within the walls of Disney, and so he channeled that untapped creative energy into his own experimental films. This would eventually lead him away from Disney and into the warm embrace of the much more radical for the time MTV, where he was given that creative freedom that he desperately needed to explore. It was here that Selick would develop and express his truly unique style, initially with the now iconic MTV bumpers that aired throughout the 1980s. This success led him to develop a pilot for a proposed series with 1991's Slow Bob in the Lower Dimensions. And while the series was never ordered, Henry's creativity and technique were undeniable at this point. Just as the underappreciated Frankenweenie had caught the attention of Paul Rubens, who then hired Tim Burton to direct Pee-wee's Big Adventure, it wasn't long before Henry Selick received a call from his old co-worker, Tim Burton, who was looking to revive an old concept. Which brings us all back around to The Nightmare Before Christmas, which, when we left it, now had 10 songs, but still no script, and desperately needed to start filming.
We signed off on a schedule of starting into production without a working screenplay. We had a couple of great songs from Danny, and between Caroline Thompson coming in later to stitch together the songs, and a brilliant story department led by Joe Ranft, with Mike Cucciarelli and Jorn Klubin, and I mean, that was the story department. We just blissful idiots. Sure, this will work. We began making the movie even though we hadn't figured out the full story. And that's what we had to start with, and eventually made it, pieced it together.
And so now, with that firm concept in place, musical numbers composed, and an actual script, Henry and his team of artists could now fully realize Tim Burton's original vision.
A very important part of doing really good stop motion is the same as any other animation, and that's being able to act things out for yourself and really feel it, and then translate that into what the character does.
They'll memorize it with their body, act it out several different ways. I'll act it out for them. We go back and forth and arrive on something.
Though when the completed film was finally getting near release, Disney started to get cold feet.
It did one preview before it opened, and I think from that preview, Disney basically learned there was no audience for this movie and kids hated it. And so all merchandising was pulled, And the marketing suddenly shifted from what was going to be towards a young audience to try to find an adult audience, or almost sell it like it was. They had no idea what to do with it. The preview was a disaster. There's nothing you can do. They put it in front of a bunch of kids that were expecting a Disney animation. And obviously, they were expecting something closer to The Lion King or Little Mermaid, and they were getting Nightmare Before Christmas.
From the beginning, Walt Disney established a tradition of innovation. From the world's first full-length animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, to the new photographic techniques introduced in 101 Dalmatians, the combination of animation and live action in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and the dazzling use of computer technology in Beauty and the Beast. Now, Walt Disney Studios is joining forces with Tim Burton, the creative genius behind Batman, Beetlejuice, and Edward Scissorhands, to bring you one of the most extraordinary and exciting motion pictures of our time. Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas.
The brilliant executives were like, they hate it.
It wasn't what they were expecting, and they didn't know what to do with it, so they just put it out, and it died pretty quickly.
It was one of those things where I loved it, I had the exact same feelings, but I also felt, I could feel it, this is something different, and not everyone who's come loves it right away. And so there was a joy, but there's also a sadness, like, well, we made it for this much, it made twice that, and we had our time, and it will drift away and be gone. I had no idea that this other thing would happen.
Of course, this other thing that happened was the cult following and eventual rediscovery of Nightmare Before Christmas in the mainstream. And anyone that's been to any of the Disney parks around Halloween can tell you just how front and center the company now puts the film. But that's not where this story ends. There's just one more piece of evidence we need to look at. In a 2022 interview with AV Club to promote his new film Wendell and Wild, Henry Selick opened up about how unfair he's felt it is that Tim Burton is often credited as the primary creative force behind The Nightmare Before Christmas. And the fact that Disney had apparently added Tim Burton's to the title just 3 weeks before release had minimized the fact that it was he and his team that had constructed and directed everything.
There's always been this debate on who really put the most work into this movie, or whose movie is this?
You know, the fact is, there wouldn't have been the film, it wouldn't have been nearly as good without Tim. It just wouldn't have existed. It was his power that he got after doing films like Batman. But I mean, it's me and my team that made the movie. I mean, we shaped the story, we storyboarded it all. Every step of the way, we wanted it to feel like Tim's world. But Tim was down in LA making 2 other films. He basically loved everything we did. The only adjustments were, he sent out Rick Heinrichs, who's one of the all-time great production designers and who was Tim's first creative partner, to help us get the look down, to make it darker and simpler. And then the very, very end, Tim showed up with his editor, Chris Levinson, to trim things out. So that's really the relationship. You know, it's his movie in a major creative way, but we made it, and we made all the pieces fit. We brought these characters to life.
To make things even more confusing, in that interview with AV Club, Tim Burton isn't the only person that Selick calls out. Now, of course, if you ask Danny Elfman, well, that's his movie. When he finished the film, it was so funny because he came up to me and shook my hand. "Henry, you've done a wonderful job illustrating my songs." And he was serious, and I loved it. Which brings us all back to the original question of whose movie is this? Who deserves most of the credit? To me, the answer seems pretty clear. It's all of their movie. All 3 deserve the credit. After going through all of this evidence, it's obvious that The Nightmare Before Christmas wouldn't exist as the holiday classic that it is today without each bringing their own brand of unique brilliance to the table. Can you imagine this movie without Tim Burton's gothic surrealism? Or without Danny Elfman's iconic soundtrack? Or especially without the warmth and emotion that Henry Selick's animation breathed into these characters? Of course not. Film is a collaborative medium, and it's at its best when each and every artist at the table brings all that they've got. That clearly happened with Nightmare. and that's what should be celebrated. But Selick did get totally hosed here, and it's great to see that his contributions are finally being recognized, almost 30 years too late. And even though Tim Burton has promised not to allow Disney to make a sequel or a reboot, that hasn't stopped them from finding a couple of really sneaky loopholes. Check out my video on the forgotten Nightmare Before Christmas sequel and prequel. Both are surprisingly good.